Members, we are on the dealing with the address and reply, and the question is that the motion be agreed. As this is the honourable member's valedictory speech, the usual courtesies of the House apply. The Honourable Aussie Trump.
Thank you, President. It's quite a hard act to follow with the Honourable Rosie Sahana. I congratulate the Honourable Rosie Sahana on, I think it was the first Indigenous female elected to this House, and I actually crossed paths with the Honourable Rosie Sahana when I worked at the Aboriginal Legal Service and visited her organisation, Nirrumbuk, in Broome, and I do know how, in the high regard in which she's held as a representative of her community. So it's somewhat of an honour to follow the Honourable Rosie Sahana. President, the greatest people in this parliament are the staff, the clerks, the very personable Grant Hitchcock, and the ever-welcoming and upbeat character that is Rob Hunter, Manager, Parliamentary Services. Aside from being able to speak for the people in here, the greatest privilege is the provision of an electorate office and electorate staff, and Nick Maher in my Bunbury office has been a complete godsend. I could not imagine anyone better able to find the parts of the bills that need to be opposed and amended, nor anyone better at identifying community issues and moral issues that need to be spoken about in here. It has also been a privilege to have an electoral allowance. Recently I was able to provide $5,000 to a fundraiser for Bunbury cricket and footy gun Glenn Deering, who has stage 4 cancer. I provided the same amount to Shining Hope, a suicide prevention charity in Bunbury. Glenn Deering will need a lot of things to turn his way as he embarks upon several treatment options. Even more important than giving money is sending our prayers to Glenn and his family, wife and children. We hope that treatment is successful and that Glenn's wife and kids find ways to cope and thrive, whatever the outcome. By contrast, Labor MPs have been caught red-handed by the Salary and Allowances Tribunal pumping hundreds of thousands of their electoral allowance into party coffers. Oh my God, the opportunity cost of using their electoral allowance to fund their party is that worthy and possibly maybe even life-saving causes in the community miss out. Shameful, greedy and disgusting. Labor already received something like $5 or $6 million in reimbursements from the taxpayer for the recent election campaign, having doubled the taxpayer funding to themselves. Again, shameful. I note that One Nation, who won 2 seats in the last election in this House, aren't eligible for any reimbursement under the now doubled taxpayer-funded election scheme. How is that fair? With political parties, the rich get richer, and it gets harder for the miners and independents to compete. But that's what the majors want. My name change to Aussie Trump has been reported all over the world, and each time it has been reported as a protest against the legislation rammed through by the extreme left authoritarian WA Labor government. See above, where they doubled the taxpayer funding to themselves whilst remaining an unincorporated, totally unaccountable and unregulated organisation. Aussie Trump launched a worldwide protest against the harm inflicted to our democracy, our families, our kids and livelihoods, getting the message across America through the US News website, the Colorado Springs Gazette and the Times in India, as well as the UK Telegraph, has been awesome. Worldwide exposure of a truly terrible government determined to misuse its majority, often to help its own electoral chances and even fill its own coffers. Equally awesome has been that every position I've taken on behalf of electors in this place has been entirely vindicated by the passage of time. The vile abuse I've received from the government benches has merely demonstrated without exception how accurate my statements to the House have been. The more accurate the statement I make, the more savage and desperate the protestations by WA Labor. Asking for a reduction in immigration is now widely accepted, even with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to a degree, and was something I called for in my term. Now a 2-year ban on foreign purchases of residential homes has been adopted by federal Labor. Again, something I called for. A pause on mRNA vaccines is something else I called for and has now been acted on by several American states and is being considered by some countries in Europe. My opposition to the changes to workers' compensation have been vindicated, and the government was not honest about the implications of contractors being excluded from coverage with the new legislation, which now appears to be confirmed by the WorkCover website, with those on site as contractors no longer meeting the definition of worker. At the very least, WorkCover should be advising these contractors to get income protection cover. Voting 1 versus 29 against the workers' compensation bill was one of my best moments and has totally been vindicated by time. Hansard will show that the Honourable Matthew Swinburne was not being honest about the impact of these changes, and that Shadow Minister...
I think this is highly unusual, President, but for a member to make an accusation regarding my intentions for the final speech would be highly disorderly in my view, and I think he should be asked to withdraw that statement.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I'm going to consider the matter briefly. Members, there are conventions around what we address in our valedictory speeches. There are also standing orders which guide us. The part of the importance of this place is that we do not accuse individual members in a way that is offensive and intolerable. The Honourable Member has asked that you withdraw that statement, and our usual practice when asked for, that words be withdrawn, our usual practice is that is the case. I invite the Honourable Member to withdraw the accusation and continue.
I withdraw the accusation about honesty, President.
Continue. The Honourable Aussie Trump.
In my view, the Honourable Matthew Swinburne was not being entirely frank about the impact of these changes, and that Shadow Minister at the time, Honourable Steve Thomas, didn't understand them. Honourable Steve Thomas was commending the government for the rare circumstance in which a contractor would be covered, i.e. working outside his trade, and not comprehending that whilst working in his trade, the contractor would now not be covered. It wasn't that hard to understand. Just read the Australian Lawyers Alliance report like I did. This was a farce. This was a farce. I realised then that this House wasn't necessarily about serious debate, but people getting paid to do their jobs weren't doing their jobs. I very early on realised it was often a pantomime. People playing parts that they were allocated, like in amateur production, but actually not wanting to understand how to do their roles properly. I did lose a bit of interest, I admit. The level of debate wasn't up to the standard I expected. I now hand over to the Honourable Neil Thompson and the Honourable Nick Garan to take over the task that I've contributed to in a small way in calling out poor performances and poor legislation rammed through by this present government. I am also delighted that Phil Scott and Rod Caddies from One Nation will be well placed to contribute to this. Likewise, Marika from the Australian Christians will add a common sense approach. I wish the opposition and the Conservatives on the crossbench the best of luck dealing with an extreme left-wing Green legislative agenda. I support Conservatives because social conservatism is needed to unwind some of the leftist nonsense that has been pushed through. Common sense is now classified as conservatism relative to the leftist stuff. Anyone who says that a crossbencher in a parliament with a large majority Labor government in both houses can make a difference hasn't been in the position of being a crossbencher in a parliament with a large majority Labor government in both houses. It's really a depressing state to be in. I'm really not sure how meaningful it is to raise objections and make speeches about biased and unfair bills that have been put forward by the government in the last 2 years. It's fairly miserable, and I don't see that changing. One Nation, Australian Christians and truly conservative Liberals will have another 4 years of fairly ineffective and frustrating pain as they deal with the Labor majority in the lower house and the Labor Greens majority in the upper house. I'm not sure that that's enjoyable. The Honourable Nick Garran will continue to scrutinise legislation better than anyone ever has or will in this place, with his superior legal knowledge and parliamentary experience, but I doubt if it classifies as enjoyment. But we are lucky to have the Honourable Nick Garran and others like him who continue in a workmanlike way for their electors, because it is the only hope we have. The real opportunity for enjoyment has been lost because the Liberals overall, under the leadership of Libby Medham, wasted an opportunity at the ballot box by playing it far too safe, weak and gutless. Peter Dutton is facing the same problem now and will struggle to actually win the election. You have to be substantially different to Labor to win it, not a watered-down version of Labor. There are ample opportunities for Ms Medham to attack the government over its integrity and immoral behaviour, such as we saw with the ramming through of late-term abortion legislation, upping the initial cut-off from 20 to 23 weeks in this state. There were 14 police officers stood down at a cost of $4 million to the taxpayer and then terminated 2 years after the mandates had ended. And with a desperate need for more experienced police officers, there is no question that these officers could have been returned to work, as they were in other states in Australia. The oppressive firearm laws, which hand unprecedented powers to the Police Commissioner, could have been attacked far more meaningfully by the Liberals. The gender madness, which has led to many children being misled into transitioning sex and which is now being unpacked around the Western world, draws a distinction between those with a grasp on morality and how to deal with troubled adolescents and those who pursue a very dangerous transgender ideology at the expense of vulnerable children who in some cases haven't even been through puberty but encouraged to identify as another sex and legally transition to the other sex, setting in place a pathway to surgery and totally unnecessary mutilation of their bodies. I know this because the people who have spoken to me about having lost their children, Tess, to trans cults, and so it is negligent and even malicious for the government to have rammed through a bill that facilitates this process. The bill I refer to is the Birth Test Marriages Registration Amendment, Sex or Gender Change Bill 2024. Ms Medham could have drawn a distinction as a mother and drawn on her experience as a common sense parent. Labor have been captured by unrepresentative fringe groups, mainly Rainbow Labor, that have taken over the legislative agenda, despite many Labor MPs knowing full well that sex and gender change legislation was nonsensical and harmful to our children's grasp of biological reality, but nevertheless voted for the party line. Around the world, my position has been vindicated. The recent Australian case, Reed Devon, D-E-V-I-N, reported in the Australian newspaper on 25th of April, the judge said, the article says, a scandalous lack of evidence for gender-affirming treatment model used in our children's hospitals. There is a scandalous lack of evidence. The risk of serious harm for our children and adolescents and the incoherence of this worldview with its denial of biological reality. Justice Paul Strum in the Reed Devon case remarked that the gender clinic's policy of unreserved affirmation of a child's gender identity without questioning or exploring underlying issues was concerning. The government has denied biological reality by their nonsense legislation, allowing children as young as 12 to legally transition their biological sex on their birth certificates to the other sex. Not gender, biological sex. This, doctors tells me, is the first step in what can be a harmful pathway towards surgery. The case of Devon tells us that encouraging and facilitating children down this path with bizarre nonsensical legislation like Labor's sex change legislation, particularly before puberty, is harmful. On April 16, the UK Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the legal definition of woman and sex under the Equality Sex Act 2010 refers to biological sex. This decision clarifies that single-sex spaces like refuges and sports can legally exclude trans women, as they should be able to. Our Attorney-General at the time irresponsibly said such an ability to protect women in their spaces was unnecessary. Contrast this ruling to the ludicrous contention of the Honourable Sally Talbot that biological sex is a social construct, which stands as vindication of my point. So a legislator like the Honourable Sally Talbot supporting sex change legislation that blatantly denies biological reality, contrary to Supreme Courts here and in the UK, shows that party ideology and towing party lines is placed above logic and serious debate in this place. Again, I lose interest. Trotting out party lines that deny reality is preferred ahead of actually scrutinising legislation for the betterment of the people. For those at home, consider these party-based positions. A dozen female Labor MPs supporting the lawful termination of pregnancies because the baby is female, sex selection. So female Labor MPs supporting the killing of unborn girls. How? Why? Not because they think it's a good thing to allow, but because the party told them to support this practice remaining lawful. Consider a wheatbelt Labor MP and sheep farmer supporting the removal of specific regional wheatbelt representation in this House and supporting the shutdown of the critical live sheep export industry. Yes, these things have happened on my watch, and you can see why launching a worldwide protest with my name change was needed. Thank you, AAPT, the Australian newspaper, and the UK Telegraph for picking this up. Again, as before, I say that 25 MPs could easily be eliminated from this parliament. Don't tell me that Bicton, Bateman and Bibra Lake need 3 MPs to represent what are homogenous electorates. I lived in those areas for 20 years. It's a system that supports the payment of MP salaries, not proper representation. I know this because I asked Mark McGowan at the time if he would merge electorates, and his response wasn't that representation would suffer. He said he was concerned that if that happened, some of his Labor colleagues would lose their jobs. I even provided Ms Medham with statistics showing that the increase of 4,000 in reported chest pain presentations among under 40-year-olds during the COVID vaccine mandate years, something as opposition health spokesperson you would think she would follow up with the government, but chose not to because it was viewed as too risky for her and too much of a hot topic for her to go to an election with. Weak. No guts, no glory. Likewise, I condemn Roger Cook's nasty dismissal of the Port Hedland motion causing for a pause on mRNA vaccines. Vaccine safety was an obvious line of attack for Ms Medham, but again, not pursued due to a lack of fortitude. Emerging positions around the planet, including from prominent virologists and cardiologists, causing for a pause on these experimental vaccines, has not even been considered by the major parties in this state. Again, no guts. Senator Gerard Rennick and his policies are the only answer. I completed an economics degree, but traditional economics is simply sending my constituents broke. Cost of living is deliberately inflated by immigration and shutting down our natural energy sources. Drill, baby, drill, I say. Bring down energy prices for the people and small business. Anthony Albanese naively calls Gerard Rennick a cooker because Honourable Anthony Albanese seems to lack the intelligence to match Senator Rennick and Senator Rennick's extensive qualifications in tax law. Senator Rennick wants to intervene in the energy, banking, superannuation and insurance markets to ensure consumers aren't price gouged and return wealth to the people. If we get local production up and tax the massive corporations and foreign multinationals appropriately, we can actually stop taxing people who earn modest incomes of $60,000 or so, and even give them a sort of universal wage with printed money. This is like a social credit system. Look it up. Look after our everyday Australians first. Tax the multinationals, which are also the donors to the major parties, properly. It's pretty simple. Senator Rennick knows we're in a state of inertia where good ideas never get adopted. Senator Rennick confirms that his friends who remain in the Liberal Party admit to not speaking out for their constituents, for fear of losing pre-selection. It is worse in Labor. He confirms that the major parties effectively collude to keep feathering their own nests. The major party system is killing this country. In the election we just went through, Labor, aided by Liberals, managed to force independent candidates to get 250 nominations and $2,000 per candidate just to get on the ballot paper for independents, and then force independents to form a group of 5 just to compete with the parties above the line. We actually did pretty well to get our group of 5. I thank all who helped. I enjoyed campaigning and loved meeting others who were trying to disrupt the majors. It was a lot of fun. I still believe that shutting down of the live sheep export industry should spell the end of the Honourable Anthony Albanese, the Honourable Josh Wilson and the Honourable Patrick Gorman. It is the most glaring example of Labor's attack on rights and families and small business, especially when the Honourable Jackie Jarvis has confirmed the animal welfare standards in the industry are okay, and therefore that Federal's Labor's claim that social alliance is lost is a lie. Aussie Trump says keep the sheep and drill baby drill. I again call for contested hearings in the interim family violence order space. Ex parte hearings may be allowable, but the court must hold a contested hearing where the other party gets to say their piece within 2 weeks. And there must not be any evictions from homes until a contested hearing has been held. In my own case, I was living in the family home and my wife had moved out and expressed a desire to get back in the house but wanted me to leave. And it was only then that she came up with nonsense allegations of me killing a family pet and not allowing her to see her sister. Completely untrue, but enough to get the police to evict me from my house and put her in there. Of course, my ex-wife gains an advantage of having possession of a $1.1 million house and custody of our children through the misuse of the system. I know contested hearings are needed, especially when I acted as a lawyer in a case where neither party were allowed back to the home in Christmas 2022. It can't be the case that neither party be allowed to stay in the home at Christmas due to cross-claims. A contested hearing would resolve this, and in a big 5-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms, a deal could have been struck to live it in separate parts of the house. Don't tell me the FVRO system isn't broken. This is evidence that it is. My opportunity to contest the interim family violence restraining order and obtain residency in the house, even in the rear self-contained unit into which I had initially moved, was lost because no contested hearing was offered for 5 weeks or so, by which time I had sent emails, which although I was encouraged to send emails by the court order in relation to children and property, the ones I sent were off topic. I accept and own that mistake. The IFVRO was also being used as leverage in property settlement, and you could say even used to successfully extort money from me. Thankfully, the other party was honest and testified on oath that I was never physically violent, because of course I wasn't. Sadly, I was the one getting slapped and hit. The so-called emotional violence or coercive control stuff is wide open to being misused by men and women alike. And whilst we continue to fracture families and give possession of houses to one party based on ex parte submissions rather than contested hearings, the damages to people's lives continue. Sadly, there is never any punishment for perjury, false allegations, and the merry-go-round of lies continue. Women particularly, but also some men, are rewarded with sole possession of the home and sole custody of the kids as a reward for their false claims, at least in the short term, until the family court gets to schedule a hearing 2 years down the track. The notion of people first is so far from what I have experienced in here. The public should be really worried about the complete lack of regard that the parties in this parliament have for helping electors. As Senator Rennick's party name suggests, we could put people first if parties were not using all of the parliamentary time looking after themselves first.